Nelson Mandela is often remembered as a symbol of peace. But before he became a global icon, he was a prisoner. Before he became president, he was labeled a criminal. And before the world celebrated his leadership, he spent nearly 3 decades confined behind bars. To understand Mandela, one must begin not with the image of the smiling statesman, but with the young boy born into a traditional African society at a time when his country was moving toward one of the most rigid systems of racial control in modern history. Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in the small village of Mvezo, located in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. His birth name was Rolihlahla Mandela, a Xhosa name that is often translated to mean troublemaker. He was born into the Tambo royal family, a lineage that connected him to traditional leadership structures long before he would encounter modern political systems. His father served as a local chief, and through him, Mandela was exposed early to discussions of authority, leadership, and governance. After his father's death, Mandela was taken in by the acting regent of the Tembu people. This transition from his immediate family into the regent's household placed him at the center of traditional political life, where he observed how decisions were made, how disputes were resolved, and how leadership was exercised within an African context. His early education took place in missionary schools. It was in one of these schools that he was given the name Nelson, a common practice at the time, where African students were assigned English names by their teachers. From an early age, Mandela was therefore navigating 2 worlds, one rooted in African tradition and the other shaped by colonial influence. He later attended the University of Fort Hare, one of the few institutions of higher learning available to Black Africans in South Africa. Fort Hare was not just a university, it was a center for developing African leadership. But Mandela's time there was cut short. He was expelled for participating in a student protest, an early indication of his willingness to challenge authority. Following his departure from Fort Hare, Mandela moved to Johannesburg. This move marked a decisive shift. Johannesburg was not a traditional environment. It was an industrial city shaped by mining, labor systems, and racial segregation. There, Mandela worked as a law clerk while continuing his legal studies. It was also in Johannesburg that he became politically active. In 1944, Mandela joined the African National Congress, commonly known as the ANC. The ANC had been established earlier, but Mandela and his peers believed it needed to adopt more assertive strategies. That same year, he helped establish the ANC Youth League. The Youth League pushed for mass mobilization, protests, boycotts, and civil disobedience, rather than gradual negotiation. At this point, South Africa was undergoing a major political transformation. In 1948, the system known as apartheid was formally introduced. Apartheid was not simply social discrimination. It was a legally enforced system that controlled where people could live, where they could work, how they could travel, and what political rights they could exercise. Under apartheid, the majority Black population was excluded from meaningful participation in national governance. Mandela's political activities intensified during this period. He became involved in organizing campaigns of resistance. Initially, these campaigns were non-violent, but the state's response was often harsh. Protests were met with arrests, bans, and violence. By the early 1960s, a critical decision was made. Mandela and other leaders concluded that peaceful protest alone was no longer effective under the existing conditions. As a result, Mandela became a key figure in the formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC. The organization engaged in acts of sabotage targeting infrastructure with the intention of pressuring the government without causing loss of life. This marked a turning point. Mandela was no longer only a political organizer. He had become a figure associated with armed resistance. In 1962, he was arrested. 2 years later, in 1964, he was sentenced to life imprisonment following the Rivonia trial. The charges included sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. Mandela was sent to Robben Island, a prison located off the coast of Cape Town. Conditions on Robben Island were harsh. Prisoners performed hard labor, including breaking stones in a quarry. They were subjected to strict controls, limited communication, and minimal privileges. Yet even within prison, Mandela's role evolved. He became a leader among inmates. He encouraged education, discipline, and unity. Robben Island itself became, in some ways, a place of political learning. Over time, Mandela's imprisonment drew increasing international attention.
Globally, movements began calling for his release. Economic sanctions were imposed on South Africa. Protests were organized in multiple countries. Mandela's name became synonymous with the struggle against apartheid. By the late 1980s, the pressure on the South African government had intensified. In 1990, President F.W. de Klerk announced Mandela's release. After 27 years in prison, Mandela walked free. His release did not mark the end of struggle. It marked the beginning of negotiation. South Africa was deeply divided. There was real risk of civil conflict. Mandela entered into negotiations with the government to dismantle apartheid and transition to a democratic system. These negotiations were complex and often tense, but they resulted in a historic outcome. In 1994, South Africa held its first multiracial democratic elections. For the first time, citizens of all races were allowed to vote. Nelson Mandela was elected president of South Africa. The prisoner had become the president. Yet, his greatest test was still ahead. The country he now led had been shaped by decades of division. There were expectations of justice, and there were fears of revenge. Mandela chose a particular path. He emphasized reconciliation rather than retaliation. One of the key mechanisms for this approach was the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This commission allowed individuals to testify about crimes committed during apartheid. In some cases, perpetrators could receive amnesty if they fully disclosed their actions. The goal was not to erase the past, but to confront it openly in order to move forward. Mandela served as president from 1994 to 1999. He chose not to seek a second term. This decision reinforced the principle of democratic leadership and peaceful transfer of power. In 1993, even before becoming president, Mandela was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which he shared with F.W. de Klerk. The award recognized the joint efforts to end apartheid and establish democracy. After leaving office, Mandela continued to engage in global advocacy. He spoke on issues such as peace, HIV/AIDS awareness, and social justice. Over time, his image evolved from that of a political leader to that of a global moral figure. Nelson Mandela died on December 5, 2013, at the age of 95.
His life spanned colonial rule, institutionalized apartheid, armed resistance, imprisonment, negotiation, and democratic leadership. Few individuals have experienced such a wide range of historical phases within a single lifetime. Mandela's legacy is often described in terms of forgiveness, but it is also a legacy of strategy, discipline, and long-term vision. He understood when to resist, when to negotiate, and when to reconcile. He understood that leadership is not only about gaining power, but about shaping what comes after power is achieved. As he once said, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. The next time you hear the name Nelson Mandela, do not think only of the image. Think of the timeline. Think of the systems he confronted. Think of the decisions he made at critical moments. Because leadership is not defined by a single event. It is defined by a sequence of choices made under pressure. Hopefully, you have learned, laughed, and leveled up. Later, we shall see how much you have retained.